doing it? Okay. Thank you very, very, very much, Moshe. That was fascinating. And I need to apologize because when we built this track, we had to find a way to balance between the fact we had a lot of really, really good speakers we wanted to bring in and the fact that the session is quite long. It's 3.5 hours, and the fact that there's a session that is going to be right after us. So we had to force all of our speakers to try and limit everything within the realm of 15 minutes, which is hard. On that note, I'll be brief. So the next lecture is going to talk about data analytics. I spoke earlier about the importance of incident response, and of course incident response a lot of times is driven by the force of data analytics. Now, there are a lot of people out there that are talking and doing data analytics, but I think you will find that our next speaker is in a very interesting vantage point to talk about data analytics. He works for a very small company that is named GE. Anyone here heard of GE? Anyone here knows what GE does? Do you know? Russ? Well, GE is one of those companies that we know as consumers, but we have no idea the extent of the range of the products. I mean, lights, industrial systems, laptops, fridges, right? Cars, I don't know, maybe, yes, no. Well, it's really one of those companies that is anywhere and everywhere. And the next speaker, I'm going to have to read out your title because it's too long for me to memorize. He's the Chief Security Officer for GE Digital, and he's the General Manager of the Industrial Internet Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. But the point that I wanted to mention here is that you're also responsible for the SSDLC framework within GE, right? The Secure Software Development Lifecycle. For Predix. Exactly. So this is really if we're talking about the future of cybersecurity, I would say, I don't want to give a number, but in like the double-digit figure of percentage of what we consume as electronics, I think that it's in Russ Dietz' hands. So please, Russ, welcome on stage.
Great. All right. Whoa. Okay. Real quick, great introduction. Scary stuff, industrial systems, all of that good thing. And you're probably saying, well, what is it that we have to do with at all when it comes to cybersecurity? Why is that such a critical area for GE? Well, it has to do with what we're about to go through today, and that specifically is a transformation that's really happening now in the industrial space. And that's the drive to the same automation we've seen occur in the overall kind of enterprise resource management, contact resource, all of those things that we've seen in the enterprise IT domain are now really starting to move full steam ahead into the industrial space. But before we do that, we now have to solve some problems that we thought we were done with, or at least getting closer to, I should say, when it comes to the world of what we've done with information technology. But we're finding we're not. And that has to do with, if this works. It is. Very good. And that has to do with basically looking at information. Now, if we look at the amount of information that floats around the internet, you can basically look at it, and it's very peaceful when we diagram it out into endpoints. It looks great. Unfortunately, when it comes to what it is that actually happens, information assets, data, become a critical component in how it is that we manage and operate things, especially when we look at industrials. So we're going to talk about right now basically some very specific areas that we thought were kind of critical, but in reality they're kind of changing. The first one is cybercrime. So cybercrime is a huge issue, right? It has been, and for those of you that have done any work in cybersecurity, this has been a tremendous focus. But what we're going to find as we go through this today is that that's interesting, but the work that we're doing right now has a lot more impact for some of the reasons that, that the speaker in the opening brought up. Really, the next thing that's important, and this is not to scare people, it's just a fact. The fact of the matter is that as we move into automating things, when we look at the industrial space, when we look at all of the things and how it is that, we consume energy, how we consume water, how we deal with some of the major components, that we don't even consider every day. What we really need to understand is we're moving from a period of cybercrime into a period of really this kind of this risk of collateral damage because we have actors around the globe that are specifically with nation states that are starting to realize that they need to have a foothold in what's going on in the industrial space, because they know that they can use that to their advantage. So we're really moving in a whole new direction. So you hear a lot about Internet of Things, right, when it comes to that whole process. But what I'm really here to tell you is that when it comes to the Internet of Things, it's really this user-based device thing. Well, that's fascinating for you and me, but I wouldn't even worry about it when we look at what we're dealing with in the industrial space. The next big thing, and this is a little bit of what we heard in the introduction, is basically data and analytics. The fact of the matter is, the scary thing is that in the past, when we came to what we were dealing with in cyber, we really had to deal with the user experience and the user situation as kind of like the first line of defense. But in reality now, when we have machine-to-machine or when we have data analytics sourcing decision-making, we have a real problem in that we're not involved in the execution of those decisions. Okay? Humans are involved. That safety button, the big red button, it's gone. Okay? And data is now forming what it is that is going to happen in those environments. So the next big piece, which was interesting to hear a little bit about cloud discussion, because I could give you a whole another layer on top of the great conversation we just had on cloud, because that's a lot of what we do. But because information is going to become such a critical part of what we're doing when it comes to this, security and privacy and compliance, they literally are the measures of how well data and analytics are being lifecycle managed and secured. So you really need to be able to understand those in great detail so that you can map them into the situation that you have and understand the cyber readiness of the team that you're working with. And that's a big thing for us inside of GE. We're spending a tremendous amount of time on that aspect of getting that mapped right. And the last big piece in all of this is where the cyber solutions are moving to. And at the end, I'm going to give you kind of 6 really hot areas that are emerging right now that are going to be taking into consideration the overall discussion. Some of my peers here from GE would shoot me for saying that a lot of these things are disappearing from interesting because we still deal with them every day, the list that I have here. But when you see the things that we're going to be dealing with, this kind of stuff is just old hat, okay, when it comes to where life is all about. So first piece we touched on a little bit is this migration that's going on, and I think it's really important for folks to understand this. The migration that we have that's happening from where attacks were to where they're going. So when you look at kind of some of the elements that are being tracked right now out there, and we go back, we can see that back in in 2015, just 1 year ago, and by the way, we went back 5 years, this is even more interesting, the level of real attacks that are related around cyber war or cyber espionage is really a small component of what was going on. 3.3% is still pretty significant, but I could even get to a zero place if we went a few more years back. But in reality, when we look at what's happened just in the last year, the level of attacks and impact in what we call cyber warfare, where you have nation states involved, has dramatically increased, okay? And by the way, this number, when you, again, look at it back even 3 years, it's even more impactful as to what's going on. So we really need to make sure that we're looking at, what's behind all of that. The other thing that's really concerning to me, and because I've been doing this for a long time, is what we call unknowns. So in this world, right, the thing we really don't like is what we call unknown unknowns, okay? And we won't go through the Donald Rumsfeld speech today, but the reality is that's the scary part of what it is that we deal with. And when we look at the kinds of attacks that I just talked about, and when we map them to the level of unknowns, when you're looking at like 41% unknowns, that basically says there's a lot of what we call new weaponry, okay, or new capabilities that are continuously being introduced. So that in and of itself, on top of where you see it going, says that there's a lot of money behind what's going on right now, okay? So it's something we need to be concerned about. So this walk that we're talking about, it basically went from crime, we saw a lot of activism, right? And then we've really seen, in the last 5 years, the leveraging of literally terrorist activities. State-sponsored has been really driven up. Then we're starting to see what I call really serious weaponized capabilities right now. And this is very concerning when we start to think about data used as a source. A lot more difficult to deal with when it comes to actual humans or decision making. And then finally, as soon as you get to this weaponized state, you can jump very quickly, and that's what we're seeing now, into really globalized because of the hyperconnectivity that we have. So walking that path, the cost and complexity of living in this space is dramatically higher. So if you think about it from an industrial standpoint, this is one of the reasons why you have to have something like a GE get into this space, because of the cost and complexity of dealing with critical infrastructure that you're trying to really hyper-automate. So when we look at that aspect of it and we touch the machine piece of it, a lot of folks think of 3 different areas when they think of this IoT space. There's the piece that I'm really interested in and concerned about, the industrial piece. There's consumer, okay? And then there's machine to machine. Now, why are 1 and 3 different? In the primary area of the industrial space, a lot of it has been through automation, but it's human interaction in the automation process. The thing that's happening that's wickedly wild is taking the human out. So when we look at IoT, even though you hear a lot about it from a standpoint of what we do with it, the thing to really understand is that machine-to-machine component. Now, why is that? Okay, why is that such a big deal? What's the techno reason behind it? When we look at the consumer space, again, the impact is pretty low because the systems that we're dealing with are typically things that we have some other mechanism to kind of jump in the way of a problem, okay? There are some situations in the consumer IoT space that they can move into some serious elements, but nowhere near what you see when you get to industrial, especially when you see everything that's involved in it, okay? So those are, really some very big and different kinds of threat vectors that we have to deal with. But the common thing about both of them is the use of hyperconnectivity and data and analytics, okay? So the other thing we need to understand about the industrial space itself is that it's already hyper-connected. And it's hyper-connected and we're not even really leveraging what's going on. So when you look at the heat map, right, of connectivity, you can see that it's in the industrial-rich areas when we look at just the industrial components from a standpoint of automation. But today we have this massive connectivity, but just in power gen alone, less than 2 to 8% of that data is actually being used to improve operational effectiveness. So we're creating this much larger attack surface, right? But we're really not reaping the benefit of it. And when we just look at energy processing and production automation, we know already that this is going to drive even more connectivity. And again, the usage of information assets. So another thing that happened recently, it was about a year ago, is we talked to IDC about taking a different look at what's really going on when it comes to IoT, okay? And especially when we start to look at what's happening in the industrial space. Attack surface risk is pretty high, and I was less concerned with the people and the dollars because those are interesting revenue opportunities, but the big thing is to look at the number of applications, the intelligence systems, in other words, where they can make decisions based on information, and the amount of information assets that are going to be hosted in this kind of infrastructure by 2020. So again, it's just kind of speaking even more to the amount of attack surface issues we have. Now, on top of that, we have to look very differently at how we develop. And when we talk about development, it's not only taking some of the legacy systems that we're used to from a standpoint of protecting the infrastructure, but it's also making sure that we're building systems with a secure development process. We're learning from what's happened in the past in the IT space and now applying that into this new domain where information assets are involved in making decisions. And we're really trying to make sure that the typical things that we've seen in the past when it comes to information are things that we're actually baking in and protecting right out of the gate. Another big thing is the model, okay? We heard a little bit about cloud and where information flows and how things are processed. The model that we have in the old world has a lot of focus points where information flows. So it's a lot easier to look at things like data corruption, information processing systems that could be used to attack things. But when you have hyperconnectivity and a huge matrix, you do not have that same level of structured control that you can look at. So these Internet of Things applications that are relying on information assets, we now have an even more complex problem to getting visibility to when those issues come into play. Now, let's take this really quickly to what could happen with a personal situation. And why this is such an important area for us. I mean, think about how critical information security is in the healthcare space. If your doctor is using the information to make a decision about some kind of healthcare regime he's going to put you on to solve an issue that you have. With the wrong information presented to that physician or the physicians in the chain, the wrong decisions can be made very easily about dealing with whatever it is that ails you. And that is a significant personal impact. But imagine that on a tremendously hyper scale when it comes to actual assets that are generating the power or providing thrust in an aircraft. So these kinds of areas of information assets become very critical and very personal. The other thing that's important to really leverage and understand is we kind of have this interesting problem. When we look at information assets and how they're used, especially in IoT, we're layering the problem on top of itself. When it comes to someone like a G that builds large machines, our supply chain from a software and a hardware standpoint is a really critical area. But guess what? Those factories are being hyper-automated, okay? And they're using information assets to basically make decisions about how production is going to go. So we have an even deeper problem that we have to deal with now that we're relying even more on data helping us make decisions about not only just the machines themselves, but the things that actually drive the components and build the machines. So we have a much deeper issue. So again, as we kind of get towards the end of this, right, the big thing to understand is in the machine-to-machine space, the key word is data, okay? Whereas in the past, like I said, we were really very focused on what we do as users, okay? And information protection was more of a control vector. Now it's actually the decision-making power, right? And that creates something that we have to kind of look at, both the heritage of the information, where it originated, what was done to it when it was being held and managed, and then also the analytics and the compute systems that are actually working with the information assets. The integrity of those is vital if we're going to get into a fully automated environment. So this kind of last piece of where we're going is attacking this problem. And I love this picture because it's incredibly true. We look at the consumer IoT space and everybody says, oh my gosh, it's a mountain, it's really scary. And then I look at it and say, yeah, well, no, it's an iceberg in the industrial space. And the amount of IoT issues that we have to deal with industrial, especially with information assets, is incredibly scary when we look at the complexity of hyperconnectivity, machine making decisions, the ability to impact the overall areas within plant and operations. So really that last piece that we talked about touches right into the compliance piece. I'm going to skip over this piece because we got a really good feel for it, but I just want to make sure everybody understands how important that compliance is when it comes to showing the rigor that you have to have all the way from the beginning of dealing with security to the end of what we talked about, which is coordinating and dealing with the impact. We touched on the secure by design process. Again, this is all about making sure that in every piece along the way that the code, which is another set of information, right, is being managed and designed properly through the process. And that same thing happens when it comes to deploying things, okay? Again, when you're dealing with systems where you can push code and other elements into it, the identity around the information, the devices, the software, and the individuals involved in building it all become critical in making sure that we deliver it right, because the weakest link in the chain is where all of this fails. So with all of that said, I promised a few core areas that were going to be interesting to kind of look at to deal with this new data and industrial IoT world. So we'll go through them very quickly, but the first thing you're going to hear is a lot about micro-containerization and segmentation. So in other words, because we have this complex web of stuff, we're going to have a very complex way that we have to basically contain and control it. So we're seeing this already become a big technology area. Another one is multi-party security operations. In our week here so far, that's been most of our conversations. Data heritage, in other words, where things are from, the lineage behind it, the trust that you have around it. Risk-based defense systems. In other words, instead of just saying, I protect it all, or here's what I'm going to do, really understanding what the risk is and applying it in a focused area. Standardized controls and certifications are going to become a measurable. Incident profiling, how well you do things, okay, in security is going to become critical. And then analytic proofing and vetting and verification, tools to make sure that the things that are working with information are right. And then the last piece is, I know it's overused, but anomaly detection. However, I layer modeling on top of that as a component. So those are going to be your key areas when you look at the industrial space, and they're also good hints as to where it is that we're focused. So with that, I just want to thank you for your time today. Here's a few kind of core areas that we covered today in the material. If any of you are interested in learning more, or some of you are interested in jumping into the cyberspace, you can see Vladdy back there. He's got an interesting cyber challenge for you. And we're happy to see if you can beat the challenge and win an interesting prize. And thanks very much.